Bandar Abbas Airport, 9:30 a.m., July 3, 1988. "274 passengers are waiting to board Flight 655 from Bandar Abbas to Dubai. A child asks her mother how long it takes to get to Dubai. Her mother says less than half an hour. The flight is scheduled to take place at 10 a.m. But passengers are informed that Airbus A300 will be delayed for a little while. 274 passengers, along with 16 flight crew, make up a total of 290 people. The 8th minute. The Persian Gulf, near the Strait of Hormuz, 7:45 a.m., July 3, 1988. One of the helicopters of the United States Navy cruiser USS Vincennes reports that several Iranian boats are circling around a German merchant ship. Without receiving a request for help, Vincennes quickly moves towards the German ship.
We remain alert and we'll stay alert, but at the same time I don't want to ever give the impression that we're leaning forward on our toes to get a major conflagration started here. That's not the case at all.
The war that Iraqi President Saddam Hussein started against Iran on the last day of the summer of 1980 had just entered its 8th year. Throughout the war, the Iranians had tried to put an end to it by winning the ground war. After being caught by surprise at the beginning of the war, they kept an upper hand over the Iraqi army since the 2nd year. The Iranian calendar year of 1365, ending March 20th, 1986, came to an end with the difficult Operation Karbala 5. At the end of the bloody Battle of Karbala 5, Iran kept its superior position and managed to break through the defensive line of Shalamcheh town. Iran's advance towards Basra had extensive repercussions. In an attempt to prevent the fall of Basra, the US sent the John F. Kennedy aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf. Newspapers like Der Spiegel wrote, "The US is ready with 6 battalions and 600 warplanes to fight Iran if Basra falls." The Soviet Union also expressed its concerns regarding the ongoing war and emphasized that the war should come to an end through negotiations. Iranians will probably never forget what then US Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger said back then. Weinberger said, "We need to uproot Iranians by cutting off Iran's oil exports in order to put an end to the war." Several years later, Javier Pérez de Cuellar, former UN Secretary General, wrote in his journal, "After the adoption of Resolution 598 in summer of 1987, the United States firmly believed that in order to end the war, first, the Iraqis needed to put up a good resistance to stop Iran from winning the war. Second, the war needed to be painful for the Iranians at all times. Third, the flow of weapons to Iran should drop considerably through another Security Council resolution. And fourth, the international community should put a lot of pressure on the country." In 1987, the Persian Gulf was the scene of a great confrontation between Iran and the United States of America. This confrontation brought about many bitter and hard incidents. In the spring of 1988, Iran was in a difficult situation. After the fall of Al-Fav, the American government announced that it would now support not only Kuwaiti and Saudi Arabian ships, but also those of other countries that are shipping in the Persian Gulf. They officially announced that all the Iranian officials should realize that continuing the attacks in the Persian Gulf will not be tolerated.
On the morning of July the 3rd, we were coming back through the Straits of Hormuz on the way to pick up another ship for an Ernest Will escort mission. And there was some radio communications indicating sounds of explosions or such coming from Montgomery and Vincennes.
German merchant Uligary, this is U.S. Navy warship. We are standing by channel 16, over.
Yeah, okay, 16. Do you read me?
Merchant Uligary, this is U.S. Navy warship. Read you loud and clear, over.
Okay, thank you.
On the morning of July 3rd, Captain McKenna, commander of the U.S. Naval Operations Center, was very surprised when he found Vincennes 64 kilometers away from its original position, and immediately ordered the return of Vincennes and USS Montgomery to the south and their place of deployment.
It was our concern, however, that Vincennes was acting in an overly aggressive fashion, or so it seemed, and that they were actually pursuing these boats rather than being pursued by them.
350. You count.
The IRGC were sort of a ragamuffin band, if you will. I mean, they were not very well coordinated, and certainly it wouldn't be too difficult to scare them, I don't think, into doing something that was foolhardy. If they saw a lot of military machinery bearing down on them, they could easily become frightened. It was our business out there to defend shipping against those guys, but not to provoke them. We don't know how close to the boats the helicopter actually went. There was, without getting too technical, a fixed distance that they were supposed to maintain. If, in fact, they were harassing the boats, which may have been the case, how would the boats communicate with them? Well, they would generally fire warning shots. We'd seen that happen with news helicopters there in the past. If the news helicopters or the media helicopters got too close to Iranian small boats, bog hammers, if you will, or whatever, warning shots would be fired and had been fired in the past.
Request confirmation of Montgomery Group clearing over. I repeat, they are not clearing the areas. They show erratic speed and over.
The pilot of the U.S. helicopter informs William Rogers, the commander of Vincennes, that the Iranian boats have opened fire on it. Rogers ignores the return order and goes into Iranian territorial waters, convincing Captain McKenna to let him shoot at the Iranian boats. At 9:42, Vincennes fires its cannons at the Iranian boats.
Is inbound. 350 relative? Relative. Still inbound.
The warning shots, or were they actually attacked? The helicopter wasn't hit, after all, and the helicopter could escape the area at great speed, and in fact it did. So therefore, what was Vincennes up to in going to general quarters, accelerating to maximum speed, and heading off to those boats, which at the time presented no threat to anyone?
I did not send the Vincennes to support the Montgomery. I authorized the Vincennes to send their helo. I was the only one that was in authority to send them anywhere, and my understanding was that they had asked permission to cover the area with the helicopter, and that they were also told to remain on station. At the time specified, and they were very clear cut, that you will return fire with fire, and so they asked permission to take the units under fire. I gave permission and reported the same to Commander of Mideast Force.
Bandar Abbas Airport. 274 passengers board the flight 655 from Bandar Abbas to Dubai, expecting Captain Mohsen Rezaian and his crew to take them to Dubai. After a short delay, the Airbus passenger aircraft takes off at 10:16. It was expected to land in Dubai Airport 28 minutes later.
During that engagement with the small boats, the aircraft lifts off from Bandar Abbas and then proceeds on course, essentially, slightly off schedule, as has been noted. I think they were 20 minutes or so behind schedule, climbing on a fixed course, using the proper IFF and so forth and so on.
While chasing the Iranian boats, Vincennes enters Iranian territorial waters at 10:22, thus violating maritime law.
Officer deck, presently hold the ship crossing the Iranian declared war zone line.
We did take the 12-mile limit seriously. Everybody was very concerned about it. Incurring into the 12-mile limit was verboten, and people were supposed to hold short of this 12-mile limit by several miles to prevent that from happening.
Aircraft was proceeding on a course that would take it directly over the Vincennes position. Recall again that Vincennes was in the middle of a gun battle with these small boats. Now, perhaps a battle of its own making, but firing nonetheless.
When I briefed in with the commander of the Mideast Force, I know that a very serious concern of his, as a matter of fact, he said, Dick, the one thing that I am concerned about is shooting down a civilian aircraft.
The Iranian passenger aircraft is gaining altitude when the Vincennes crew see it on their radar screen. Airbus A300 bears no resemblance to F-14 warplanes. The passenger airplane is much larger than the warplane and is not as fast as it. But the Vincennes crew say they mistook this big aircraft for the much smaller F-14 jet.
I was told that it was an F-14. I watched it. I took a look at its altitude and its speed. It was climbing, it was slow, it was in the middle of our missile envelope. The F-14, to my knowledge, had no significant anti-surface warfare capability, so I designated this thing in my own mind as a non-threat. Captain Rogers, on the other hand, involved with his gun battle at that time, announces that he is intent on taking that aircraft out at 20 miles.
Iran 14 continues to close my position. My intention is to engage at 20 nautical miles unless he earns away. You concur, over.
Got a visual on the bow camera between us.
It's climbing, it's slow, it doesn't respond. It's in the middle of our missile envelope, basically. It's vulnerable. Why would this aircraft present a threat? It did not meet any of the threat parameters that were. If Captain Rogers believed it was a military aircraft, and if he believed, as we think he did, that it was part of a coordinated effort at that point, a coordinated attack, then in his mind, he could see this as a threat.
Hence, it did make the situation much more complicated.
Both ships had attempted to communicate with the aircraft, and we were unsuccessful. We got no response back.
We could hear the challenges go out on military air distress and this civilian version of the air distress channels. So we were aware that they were warning an approaching aircraft.
Typically, if you could not communicate with an Iranian airplane, military aircraft, you illuminated them with your fire control radar, you let them know that you were there, and they would generally depart the area. When we illuminated it with our fire control radar, it didn't react.
I did not have the capability to talk directly to the commanding officer of Vincennes, simply because he was engaged on a very personal basis in a fight. and I knew they were about ready to pull a trigger on a missile that could kill my pilots, and I wanted to make absolutely certain that they didn't become the victim.
Air hostile at 004, true, 21 miles.
The aircraft crosses the 20-mile mark, and he doesn't shoot it down. At that point, I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that, okay, he has now seen that it is a non-threat.
Size is right here?
Sides.
Okay.
What I'm told transpired during that period of time afterwards is that they weren't capable of getting the shot off in an orderly fashion. So although the intent was to shoot it down at 20 miles, they sort of bungled the operation.
William Rogers, commander of Vincennes, asks the command center for permission to shoot at the Iranian aircraft. The soldiers and military crew aboard Vincennes grow more and more agitated and frightened when they hear about the impending attack of an Iranian warplane. The Iranian airliner was gaining altitude, while a warplane which is about to attack doesn't increase its altitude and just quickly attacks. The passenger aircraft sends signals that indicate it is not a warplane, and the conversation between the pilot and the control tower can easily reveal its identity. But the commander of Vincennes says they received no signals from the passenger aircraft, and that's why he decided to bring it down. A few minutes later, and just 8 minutes after takeoff, the passenger aircraft vanishes from Vincennes' radar screens, and the members of the crew embrace each other in joy. They don't know that this happiness is fleeting, and that day would become the worst day of their lives, leaving a bitter taste in their mouths forever. A short distance away, the bodies of 108 women and children are found among the 290 people who were killed in that incident. One of the eyewitnesses says, "While we were collecting the dead bodies of the passengers, we came upon a woman who was hugging her child. She was holding the baby so hard that her body had become stiff. No matter how hard we tried, we couldn't separate them from each other. It was the child who thought they would land at Dubai Airport half an hour after their flight."
We had individuals who were up in places where they could see wreckage falling, they could see the airplane coming down. It wasn't until sometime later that they described the wreckage in terms that led us to believe that it was not a military aircraft. There was too much, too large.
An Iranian Airbus is presumed crashed. Please look for survivors or aircraft wreckage.
I killed over the entire force. They spent a considerable amount of time. There was nothing there. And it's also fairly ironic that the Vincennes is the one that came upon the wreckage when it started to become apparent that this was an airliner that was involved. It was just a sickening feeling for the entire rest of the day. I can't ever remember being so dismayed, so depressed, so feeling for all of the people that were involved. It wasn't a very happy day in the Gulf for us, that's for sure. The Sides was dispatched to go close to Dubai to see if they could find wreckage, and
At first, the Americans said they had shot down an Iranian F-14. Once they found out what had happened, they claimed that the Iranian aircraft had deviated from its flight path and took no notice of the 7 warnings Vincennes had sent. It was later revealed that the Iranian aircraft was on its usual flight path. 4 years later, the New York Times reported it was USS Vincennes that had illegally entered Iranian waters, but American officials covered up the truth.
After receiving further data and evaluating information available from the Persian Gulf, we believe that the cruiser USS Vincennes, while actively engaged with threatening Iranian surface units and protecting itself from what was concluded to be a hostile aircraft, shot down an Iranian airliner over the Straits of Hormuz. The U.S. government deeply regrets this incident. Given the threatening flight profile and the decreasing range, the aircraft was declared hostile. Vincennes fired 2 standard surface-to-air missiles, at least one of which hit at an approximate range of 6 miles. An examination of the events on 3 July leads quickly to the conclusion that Iran must share the responsibility for tragedy and the investigation so found. By any measure, it was unconscionable to ignore the repeated warnings of the United States and permit an airliner to take off from a joint military-civilian airfield and fly directly into the midst of the ongoing surface action in the Strait of Hormuz, which the Iranians themselves had initiated.
The United Nations Security Council, July 15, 1988. Iran's envoy to the UN requests an emergency meeting in order to discuss the downing of the passenger aircraft. The meeting is held. The Iranian Foreign Minister and George Bush, the US representative, make a speech at the meeting. Addressing Velayati, Bush says, "If you had not continued the war, this incident would not have happened." He added that, "Mr. Minister, let me tell you something. You should choose between putting an end to the war and going against us." The war has become really intolerable for the Iranians. And 2 days after the Security Council meeting on the Airbus incident, Iran accepts Resolution 598. On July 19th, 2 days after accepting the UN Security Council resolution on the plane crash, a resolution is issued. A resolution that only expresses regret over this incident and makes some general remarks and recommendations on preventing similar incidents in the future and supporting the investigation of the International Civil Aviation Organization. Along its request for a Security Council emergency meeting, Iran asks the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, to conduct an investigation. But the results of the ICAO's final report is not very different from the Security Council statement, condemnation of the incident, and some general moral advice.
Everybody interviewed in the combat center said that the plane was descending toward the Vincennes. But the electronic record shows it never descended toward the Vincennes. But everybody had that view. I mean, they totally deluded themselves as to the nature of the threat.
Iranians later complained to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. It was obvious from the results of the case at the Security Council and ICAO that its fate would not be very different at the International Court of Justice.
Perhaps at the time of the ICAO release, we should have declassified the ship's position and issued a press release pointing out Vincennes' location within Iranian waters at the time of firing.
I spent an immense amount of time, probably the bulk of my time, looking at all the tracks and the various documentation that had been done on the tracks, and how uncertain that evidence is.
How do you explain, Admiral, the discrepancy that everything started in response to distress calls, and yet the Fogarty report later confirmed that it turned out that there were no distress calls?
I don't think I can explain, Congressman. I think he misspoke.
Mr. Fogarty?
Yes. I've talked to him about it. He doesn't remember it. I cannot reconcile it.
The reason why there was no final report is exclusively my fault. We didn't produce any further document, although we wanted to, and I got bogged down with something else that erupted. I forget what it was. The biggest problem you have in doing any investigation is the guy who commits the mistake, or whether it be an honest error or whether it be a grievous error, lies to his superiors to cover his own butt.
When the USS Vincennes finished its mission in the Persian Gulf, its commander and crew were awarded the Legion of Merit. The legal case for the passenger aircraft was settled and closed, but its historical case is still open. And each year, Iranian people commemorate those passengers who never reached their destination.